Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Vanessa, I'm drinking my coffee this morning.
Good
Shocker.
girl. That means that we're going to get some accurate information from you this morning.
I'm drinking it out of the same vessel that I drink it out of every morning. Do you know what vessel this is?
It's your white mug. And I always wonder I've spent a lot of time in your house, but I can't remember if there's more than one of those white mugs or if you wash it every day and reuse it.
No, there's like a series of 8, maybe 6 or 8.
Because I like the blue ones that Paul uses.
You do. But, both of the white and the blue are, they're mugs. They're made of ceramics and they don't have any plastics in them. When I go to leave my house, I take my coffee sometimes to go, but I have become over the past several years increasingly particular about what I drink that coffee in.
Yep.
So I used to only take a paper cup with no lid because, and we're going to talk a lot about this in this episode, because when you sip hot liquids through a plastic lid, that is one source of the topic of today's episode.
Microplastics.
Correct. But it turns out even the cup has microplastics in it. So kicking this episode off with a ceramic mug.
Yeah. I was at the gym this morning and forgot my water bottle, and they have quote unquote paper cups by the water dispenser. And I was like, in knowing we were going to record this episode, I was thinking, okay, so it feels like there's a waxy coating, but I'm guessing there's also probably plastic or maybe even PFAS to make it waterproof. And then I got home and I realized that my husband likes to eat a little pot of yogurt every morning. He likes the Icelandic Provisions yogurt. It's, when you get to our age, it's the simple pleasures in life. And after reading some of the research for preparing for this episode, I was like, hey, babe, I think we need a new morning ritual for you.
I think we need a cow.
So then I was like, let's get pots of yogurt. And I'm sort of jumping the gun here, but he was like, but aren't those plastic too? And so it's all to say, Cara, that we're going to talk about a ton of science. Mostly you're going to talk about it and I'm going to listen and ask you to clarify some points. And we're going to talk about how we can handle this stuff in our own homes and also recognize there is no perfect solution. There is no silver bullet, and everybody's going to react differently and make different choices in this situation.
I think there's not even a perfect question here for this episode. Usually the top of the episode is, here's the issue we're going to tackle. Here's the very specific thing that we are going to talk about. And we're going to help you understand this stage, moment, whatever, during puberty. We are talking about microplastics right now, where no one yet agrees where there's even causation. What microplastics might do inside the body. And so we're going to break down, really in this episode, we're going to break down all the questions, because there are an unsatisfying number of absolute answers, but there are a lot of good questions that you can be asking yourself in your home, in the grocery store, out and about when you're grabbing coffee at a coffee shop. And if you're asking them of yourself, you can then sort of by association, ask them about the kids in your life or teach the kids in your life to ask these same questions. So this is an episode with more questions than answers, but on a very important topic. So I think the best place to start is explaining what the actual we even mean when we use the term microplastics and why it matters. Because if you don't get that, then all the subtlety of the science is sort of lost. And here's an amazing thing, Vanessa. We thought about doing this episode as far back as almost a year ago when an article came out. It was published, there were excerpts of it published everywhere in all of the best medical journals. But it came out showing, it was an article about plaque in arteries.
Mm-hmm.
And it showed under a very high resolution microscope, literally pieces of plastic inside the plaque, which is the gunk that builds up inside of arteries, that is then responsible when that plaque breaks off. It can be responsible for a heart attack or a stroke. It's like a sort of a chunk of gunk that goes flying in the body. And there was this incredible study that showed that it was in March of 2024. Almost 60% of the 250 people who were undergoing heart surgery, when they actually pulled that plaque out and looked at it, nearly 60% had micro or nanoplastics that were visible.
So let's define, because there's a few different terms we're going to use today. Microplastics, nanoplastics, some more that are going to get thrown in there. And I think it's helpful to understand the distinction and also potentially the sources of the different kinds of plastics or the different sizes, if we can call them sizes. Is that a fair term? Okay.
Absolutely.
Measurements.
Sizes. Size does matter.
Size. In this case, size does matter. My husband asked me the other day, he was like, what is like an inch? He was raised on the metric system. And he's like, what's the thing of an inch that's like a quarter, an inch plus a quarter? And I was like, a quarter of an inch. And he was like, does it have another name? I'm like, no, it just is a quarter of an inch. And he was like, I was like, go back to the metric system. So in this case, no one needs to know the metric system. Cara is going to define a few of the measurements of plastics.
Yeah, ironically, the measurements that are used in all of these studies are metric system measurements. That's because it's a more rational system. I could say something about the foot, and a very average size foot for a male is actually 1 foot, right? It's 12 inches. It's fascinating, but we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. Okay. So microplastics. So when you hear the term microplastics, this is referring to plastic that is anywhere from 1 nanometer to 5 millimeters in diameter. Okay. And actually, if you go onto Google and search it and you use Google AI search, it tells you it's 1 nanometer to 5 millimeter in length. Not true. It's diameter. So diameter, just for those who have not yet started doing math homework with their middle schooler, diameter is, remember, the distance from one edge of a circle to another crossing the midpoint. So it's sort of the center of the lumen, if you will, of a circle.
Is it pi r squared? Is that how we define? Or is that the area of a circle?
That's area.
Okay.
Very good. And the r there is radius, and radius is 2r, the diameter. Yes, it's 2r. Exactly. So we're looking at things between a nanometer and 5 millimeters. And if you're curious to understand nanometer and how it relates to millimeter, and you're not super fluent in metric system, a nanometer is 1/1000th of a millimeter. Okay. So it's really like, that's a big range, 1 nanometer. Now you go up 1,000-fold and then times 5 to get to 5 millimeters. A big range of sizes that we're talking about when we talk about microplastics. Nanoplastics also exist. And those are smaller than 1 nanometer in diameter. So that's these are sort of important things to kind of put out there. What are some examples of things that are these sizes? I'm going to use, and Vanessa, I don't know if you want to play around and look up some real world examples of it, but in the things to avoid world, asbestos flakes off, and asbestos ranges from about 100 nanometers to 1 micrometer. So definitely on the smaller side there. Sand sand is usually the smallest grain of sand is about 10 micrometers. It can be as big as 1 millimeter in diameter, like a bigger piece of sand.
A sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers thick.
I mean, so here you go. That's like, look at that.
A human hair is 80 to 100,000 nanometers wide.
Yeah. Wide. I
Yes.
wonder if that's meaning diameter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the definition. That's the sort of size that we're going for. And then the other half of your question was inferred the thing that I think is the most important next thing to say, which is it just this microplastic that matters, or is there something else about the microplastics that matter? And the answer is that it's the something else. I mean, the physical, actual visible microplastic, go look up that study. It's unbelievable to see actual pieces of plastic in these coronary artery plaques. But aside from like a physical obstruction that's being caused by the plastic, it's actually all of the chemicals that are carried within the plastic that are the issue. So what are these chemicals? They are BPA, BPS. None of the studies talk about BPB, but I'm pretty sure BPB is in there. Phthalates. Phthalates are the plasticizers that make things more flexible. So your, plastic wrap, that has a lot of phthalates in it. PFAS, as you mentioned, right? The waterproofing chemical. These are all, notice they all start with P, and they're all carried by plastics. That is actually a coincidence because one has nothing to do with the other. But they're, I think, important to say that when we talk about microplastics, I think what we're really doing is talking about a gigantic bucket of endocrine disrupting chemicals that everyone who listens to this podcast has heard might be problematic for the human body. And in particular, they might be problematic for the developing human body known as the pubescent human body.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the freakiness of thinking about all this plastic existing in our bodies. And that's just like conceptually very disturbing. Like I was talking to my youngest about how they think that there's about a credit card's worth of plastic that enters the body. And that was in one of the studies I read. Is that accurate?
No, I got to poke holes in. I'm going to actually credit Andrew Huberman, who did a very good podcast about microplastics. And Andrew Huberman is a little controversial, but I encourage people to listen to this particular episode. He went through that study in detail and actually debunked it, talked about how the science, the data was reanalyzed. And when that data was reanalyzed, it actually was the new resulting data was 1/1 millionth less, like 1/1 millionth of the original volume that was thought to be ingested regularly was actually being ingested. And what the study was saying, which was, it was like a credit card's worth of plastics a month, I think, that would take 200 and some odd years. I mean, it was like a really interesting debunking of that article. But that article, I mean, this is a good moment, Vanessa, to do a PSA for how one article interpreted one way with really scary conclusions and therefore headlines tends to dominate. And that thinking, like, it's really hard to find anything other than that headline when you start initially searching for microplastics.
And it was when I had this conversation with my kid, because we were talking about some changes that I was making. I was getting rid of plastic storage and getting glass storage. And he was sort of wondering why. And we were having a conversation, and we'll get again to practical repercussions later in the episode.
Yeah, we're going to give lots of tips.
But it was the concrete nature, the sort of ability to quantify or understand or put into terms for him what, the research was saying. Now, in this case, it wasn't accurate. And to your point, Cara, there's some fear mongering and clickbaity headlines that cause people to really freak out. But the point is still relevant, which is as we have these conversations with our kids and we think about our behaviors, it is really important to help give them some concrete sense of what's actually going on.
And I think there's another layer of confusion and complexity, which is just because it's not a credit card's worth of microplastics that we're ingesting all the time doesn't mean that the amount of microplastic that we're ingesting is insignificant.
Right.
And in fact, like all you have to do is go back to that study looking at plaque in arteries. There's also another really easy one to find, which is showing microplastics in testicles.
Right. I was waiting for us to get there.
We're getting there because it's very relevant to this particular listening audience. But, all you need to do is look at those pictures to say, okay, well, credit card size amount or not, this is a significant thing that happens in our life.
So, Cara, you talked about all the things that coincidentally start with P that are microplastics that can be found in our body and can have a toxic, potentially toxic impact, among other things, on our bodies. But I'm wondering, as we think about our day-to-day lives, right? We talked about our coffee cups and getting water at the gym and, plastic wrap. Help people understand maybe where plastics can come from and maybe places where they wouldn't expect them to come from in their everyday lives.
Yeah. I mean, the sources of these plastics are really ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And the reason why is ultimately plastic itself is moldable. Mm-hmm. So it can be shaped in lots of different ways, which is super convenient. Right. And I think that at the end of the day, it's the convenience of plastic that has created the ubiquity of plastic that has created all these problems. The actual sources of plastic, how it gets from the world around us into our body, there are larger pieces of plastic that break down. I mean, one of the examples that is cited over and over and over again, I think is really significant, is tires on the road. So when cars are driving and tires are slowly breaking down, they are literally spitting off little pieces of microplastic. Those are coming into our body. We're inhaling them. We are, when I take a deep breath in my mouth and the saliva in my mouth captures things that are coming in from the environment, and then I'm swallowing them, right? So it's very much around us. There's a little side note here, I think, that's important to note for the people out there who have been fighting against using recycled tire infill for turf. So turf fields will often have recycled tire as that little crumb rubber that's in there between the faux grass blades. And there have been people for years who have been shouting from the rooftop saying this is bad for us. I think the data is pretty much there. They are right. I mean, I was with them about a decade ago. But I think the data is pretty clear. The problem is, I don't know that there's data that there's anything else out there that's a whole lot better. For a long time, the new infill du jour was coconut husk. But coconut husk has its own complication because the little fibers from coconut husk can get inhaled too. And, so it's like, once you start looking for issues, you can find issues everywhere. My only point is that there are everyday objects around us that are kicking off microplastics all the time. And sometimes to know that list is to be overwhelmed by that list, but it's important. And we should be working towards manufacturing things in the world that don't do that don't break down and get into the human body and cause problems. And that's very important in terms of prevention. There's another class of plastics that comes in that's through all the resin plastics that are used in plastic manufacturing. That's another source. Microbeads. So microbeads are used in a ton of cosmetic products. And those are absorbed by or inhaled by humans. But again, I just want to say for the umpteenth time, we don't have a direct line between these things come into our body and then we know what these things do, right? It's correlation that we see more of these things in our body now than we used to. That we haven't yet drawn a causation line. And again, I'm going to nod to Andrew Huberman for his explainer on this, and I'll just do my own version of it. But he talks a lot about the blood-brain barrier. And he talks about, and we've talked about the blood-brain barrier a lot on this podcast. So the blood-brain barrier is it's this lining that protects the brain from all the things that normally circulate in our bloodstream, because the brain is so vital and so important. And his argument is, and the brain does not turn over. It's like an organ where the cells, they die off, the neurons you don't use die, but you don't really produce any new neurons except for between 9 and 12 after you're a toddler. You just don't. And so you got to protect that organ like it's gold. And what does this? The blood-brain barrier. And so he talks a lot about how the blood-brain barrier can be violated by microplastics, because when you look at data, and the journal Nature, which is probably the best journal in medicine, I think, science and medicine. It's really a science journal. But Nature came out with an article just last week that's called Your Brain is Full of Microplastics. Are They Harming You? And it shows that microplastic levels in the brain, not only are they microplastics there, but they've increased 50% since 2016, since people started looking for them in the brain. And that the brain contains 30 times more microplastics than other organs like the liver or the kidney.
Can I just ask about that?
Yeah.
So one of the things I was really surprised to read is not only are there microplastics in bottled water, but there are significant levels of microplastics in tap water. And I'm wondering, does that somehow contribute to the amount of microplastics in the brain?
Absolutely. So the reason you're asking this very logical question is bottled water is typically bottled in plastic. So it makes logical sense that the plastics from that bottle will leach into the water, right? But tap water, it shouldn't have that same issue. And yet there are microplastics all around us in our environment that find their way into the water supply. And there are filters that you can get to filter out a lot of these chemicals. There are reverse osmosis filters. There are carbon-based filters. They're not inexpensive. But I do think they're an important thing to invest in. If you're looking to invest in water cleanliness in your house, I would actually look into these filters and do some research, because I do think that what we say on this podcast endlessly is what every physician says, what every science teacher says: hydration, hydration, hydration. So if you can't get it from plastic water bottles safely, you should be able to find a way to get it from your tap. I will say two things. The first is, don't be afraid of water in a plastic bottle. So if you are running the risk of getting dehydrated, don't look at the water bottle on the side of the field and say, I'm absolutely not drinking that because it might have some phthalates or some BPA or some other, something else carried by a microplastic. No, drink the water. I mean, it's really important to stay hydrated. The other thing I'll say is carbonated water also has a lot of microplastics. And so it's to your same point, Vanessa, that these substances are everywhere around us. They are ubiquitous.
Even carbonated water that comes from glass bottles?
Fascinatingly, yes. Apparently, Topo Chico has the highest levels by far.
Oh.
Sorry. But San Pellegrino has the lowest levels. So and it's a wide range. It's like 20 times lower or something like that.
And what contributes to the difference in the source of water?
Probably the source of water is my guess, but I haven't read those data very closely. So
I'll put my 14-year-old on the research because he has very strong feelings about different types of carbonated water.
I love it. Also, I'm just, me, there's certain types of bottled water I actually can't drink because of taste. Like I find I mean, sorry, Dasani will never sponsor our podcast, but
and Aquafina.
I can't. Yeah. I mean, I can't. And it's, those are there. I don't know if these are urban myths, but I've always heard those are made from wastewater from they're
they're like
Coca-Cola
filtered water.
Yeah, it's like the Coca-Cola wastewater from making Coke becomes Dasani, I believe. Listeners, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is what I've always heard. But the taste is distinguishably different. After reading all this microplastic data, I actually do wonder if I don't know what we're tasting, but I find it not palatable, frankly. Another
That was a hilarious
little side
not
note.
palatable. Weirdly, I don't like Evian bottled water and never have. And that's like quote unquote pure spring water.
Yeah.
I mean, who the hell knows
Pure
what
spring
it really
water
is.
in a plastic bottle.
Yeah.
And here's another one. I did not know this one before this podcast. Sea salt.
What?
I know. Okay. So here's the deal with sea salt. And now when I say this, you're going to be like, of course you're right.
I know where you're going, but
Where
go
am I
there for
going?
everyone. Well, we know that the marine environment is filled with microplastics, and that I was thinking about in the context of our food supply that fish are ingesting, absorbing the microplastics in our oceans and passing it along up the food chain, ultimately to us and larger animals. Therefore we're ingesting microplastics that way. But it would make sense that same ocean water filled with microplastics, when you evaporate it to make sea salt, would also be filled with microplastics.
Which is fascinating. So there are non-sea sources of salt. And I think it's probably...
Oh my God, I just bought a brand new huge Costco tub of sea salt. Is
Vanessa,
my Himalayan pink salt okay?
So that is so funny you say that, because apparently Himalayan pink salt is a better alternative.
Thank you,
so
Costco. Okay.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to mention is we've now talked about how they come into the body. Where do they go when they go into the body? So we talked about the brain. They go everywhere, Vanessa. They go to the liver, they go to the spleen, they go to the heart, they go to the lungs. They go to the reproductive organs. And this is where this podcast is finally going to feel relevant for some people about puberty and why we're sort of focused on this, not just as a human issue, but also as an adolescent issue. The testicles have their own barrier around them. So do ovaries and eggs. They're sort of like, each organ in the body has its own case of sorts, but
they're like the prepackaged snack packs.
Yes. Like before sous vide, like that. What's that thing called? Shrink wrap.
Yes. But natural,
not plastic.
Not
ironic.
plastic.
So when you've got genetic material that is potentially being passed along, the body does some pre-planning and is like, I got to protect that a little bit better than I protect other things. Also, some of the other organs where you find microplastics, like the kidneys and the liver, are actually cleansing organs. These are organs that filter things out of the body. So you can imagine that if they were completely protected from the blood supply, they wouldn't work quite as well.
And the liver is regenerating.
It does. The liver regenerate. I mean, all of these organs have cellular turnover, except for the brain, which just has basically cellular death for most of our life. But the testicles in particular, the reason people are so fascinated with microplastics in the testicles is the testicles tend to be pretty well protected. They do have their own sort of nice thick barrier, and still microplastics are showing up in testicles. And the really big question that we have been asked, that you listener may have right now, and I think is a very important question, is, does this impact either puberty or future fertility?
And there's, Cara, I mean, there's research that's telling us that sperm counts are down amongst people with testicles. Yes.
Now, again, is it microplastics? We don't know. There is correlation.
Right.
There is not that I know of, any causation.
But is that sperm count data about younger people, or is it about the population in general? Like, do we know?
I don't know. I mean, I will say, Vanessa, that I don't know of a ton of studies where teenagers are asked to donate sperm samples for sperm count data. You can imagine the complication there in how they collect those samples. So if people know about studies that look at sperm count in tweens and teens, I'm interested in seeing those, but I have not seen them, and I don't think there are a lot of them. I don't think there are many. But this is all sort of in an effort to paint a picture here, which is now the people are looking for it. And people started looking in 2014, about 10, 11 years ago. Now the people are looking for microplastics in the human body. Where are they finding them? Everywhere.
Cara, the other place that the research talks extensively about is microplastics in the GI tract. And, which makes sense as we're ingesting things that are, made in plastic, reheated in plastic, delivered in plastic, served in plastic, so on and so forth. And I'm sure there's other reasons, like we talked about the microplastics in water, the microplastics in actual fish and other things that we eat. What impact could that have, right? We think a lot about gut inflammation and healthy gut microbiome. What should we be thinking about in that context?
There is a very clear line between microplastics and inflammation. So here's what has been proven. We keep saying correlation, not causation. We know that microplastics and their sort of traveler BPA, BPS, phthalates, PFAS, we know those cause endocrine disruption. That's clear, which means they mess with the hormone flow through the body and hormone behavior in the body. We know that microplastics cause inflammation, and we know that microplastics can cause cell death in general, and particularly neuron cell death in the brain, is what the data is starting to show. Much of this in animal studies. In the gut, there are two kind of ways to think about how microplastics might impact the gut. So the first is when you think about the microbiome. So for those who haven't done a ton of thinking about the microbiome, just a quick refresher that these are the very healthy bacteria and other organisms that live on our gut that help us metabolize, break down our food, and we live symbiotically. We need them and they need us. And they're very much a part of healthy absorption and healthy gut processing. And when the balance in these different organisms shifts, sometimes we can see symptoms like bloating or abdominal pain. Sometimes nutrition is impacted because you cannot absorb your nutrients. And then there are links between the gut microbiome shifting and all sorts of other diseases, largely diseases of the immune system. So this sort of big category of autoimmune diseases. So if plastic gets in the way of those nice, healthy organisms doing their job, and you could tell why, I mean, that's not a hard story to imagine, right? Then we have some problems with how those nice, healthy organisms behave. The other way to think about the gut is the way that they described it in medical school, week 1. So the gut looks like a tube, except if you start to look at it in increasingly magnified ways, and you start like really diving in that very kind of journey to the bottom of the earth movie kind of way, what you will see is the gut is really not a tube at all. It has these ridges, and it has zillions of them. Not a scientific term, I know, but really like so many, it's unimaginable. And they are these little finger-like projections called villi. What's that?
I actually remember from 10th grade biology.
Yeah, villi. And they have on the ends of the villi. So like if my fingers for those who are watching this podcast, you can see my hand is up and each of my fingers might represent one of these projections. And then along the surface area of my fingers would be tiny little like spikes. And that increases the surface area even more. So it's surface area on surface area on surface area. So the absorptive capacity of the gut isn't just the length of the tube. And by the way, the gut is really freaking long, but it's also multiplied by having lots of these little projections and projections on projections. And what can happen when the gut gets inflamed is that the villi can blunt, meaning instead of being nice, big finger-like projections, they look like little stumps. And when that happens, it so significantly reduces the absorptive surface of the gut that the gut cannot do its job. And every single person has experienced this because when you have a stomach bug that causes you to have vomiting and diarrhea, ultimately, that diarrhea will blunt the villi temporarily. And even when the virus that causes it is gone, the absorptive capacity of the gut is significantly less than it was before the virus infected the intestine. Now, it only takes a couple of days for most people to regrow the villi and to have all the nice absorptive surfaces reestablished, and the gut in that way heals itself. But again, if microplastics are causing inflammation, and if inflammation blunts some of the absorption because it just clogs the machine, it reduces the absorptive surfaces, you can see how it will impact our nutrition.
Right. And there's been a lot of news about higher rates of colorectal cancer amongst younger people. And Cara, is there correlative research or causal research about the microplastics and these higher rates?
I don't know. I mean, I know there's no causation.
Okay.
That's for sure that has been established, but I don't even know if correlation has been fully established because this is a very hard one to parse when you also have a shifting food supply, lots of ultra processed foods, right? All of these other things that are impacting the way the gut works. But for those, and this is a good moment for us to pivot into what can I do about all this? Let's just start in the gut. First of all, for those who are trying to have the healthiest guts they can, eating your nutrition rather than taking it in pills and supplements, and really making sure that your fiber load is excellent on a daily basis. These are two things that can really shift the way your gut works, and they optimize your gut. So, the fiber piece is huge because all you need to do is sort of look at a diet that's heavy in ultra processed foods and, shelf stable foods that you kind of know intellectually, no, this isn't great for me. But if you're choosing between one of those and something with some actual fiber in it, whether it's a vegetable, a fruit, or a whole grain, choose that latter group in order it's essentially like doing a little bit of a sponge bath on your gut, right? You're just using the rough side of the sponge and you're just literally scraping the gut on a regular basis. And it's really, really good for you. And it should, in theory, carry out the microplastics. And I really believe if we were to all check our poop for microplastics, I think we'd all be pooping out microplastics every single day. Why do I think that? Because there's data that shows that the newborn baby, their first poop is called meconium. It's that super green, thick, sticky stuff that comes out of a baby's bottom the first time they poop. And there are microplastics in that. So Vanessa, that's, in a nutshell, that's why we're sure that these plastics are going to be, or at least I'm sure these plastics are going to be in the gut. Let's talk about other things that people can do that are really practical to protect their own bodies from microplastics and their kids' bodies from microplastics. And I think it bears repeating some of the advice we've started with at the top.
Yeah. I mean, listen, we are all incredibly busy. We are all doing the best we can, trying to feed ourselves and our families and get through the day with 1,000,001 responsibilities. So I just want to level set, just saying every decision we make is about balancing good health and taking good care of ourselves and our kids with what is realistic and what is practical. So Cara and I can share what we've done and why we've done it and things we're thinking about doing going forward based on the increasing evidence and data about the impact of microplastics and the omnipresence of them. But you will do you, and you will do you the best you can. And this is not a place for judgment. This is not us, being so prescriptive that there's no room for an alternative way of doing it. And by the way, Cara and I will be doing it differently ourselves. So what have I done in my house? I got rid of all my plastic Tupperware. I got rid of my plastic cutting boards. I replaced the Tupperware with glass. I got a huge set from Costco for a very reasonable price. I replaced with wood cutting boards, my plastic cutting boards, a less reasonable price, and I'm not even sure I love them. So stay tuned for updates on how I feel about my wood cutting boards. I've gotten rid of plastic serving cooking utensils and tried to limit that. I've stopped using plastic water bottles, we drink a lot of seltzer in my house, plastic seltzer bottles. I've moved to reusable water bottles whenever possible and glass bottles for seltzer. So that's what I have done. Looking forward, here are some things I'm working on changing. One is that I buy a lot of vegetables ready washed in plastic bags and plastic containers. So ready washed lettuces, ready cut vegetables. And even though they might be organic greens and vegetables, they're still sitting in plastic bags and plastic containers. So that is my next step, my next hurdle, except I have about 35 minutes every night to make dinner, and not having things ready washed, ready cut adds about 10 minutes to my dinner prep. And I have not yet gotten to the place of moving over because it makes my life much easier and much more efficient to have things ready washed and ready cut. So that's my point right now of tension.
I love all that. I think that's fantastic. And you're doing a great job. And I'm not just saying it like, oh, Vanessa, good job. No. It's like you've made amazing changes. I did shame you a little with the plastic cutting boards when I stayed over at your house the first time, and I didn't mean to. It was a terrible delivery, but I know.
You didn't shame me. You were just like, oh.
Yeah.
Also, I'd had those cutting boards for so long.
It was time.
Also, I did look for frying pan replacements because I do have some nonstick frying pans, and I was using green pan, which doesn't have the coating, but then I saw elsewhere there's concerns about green pan. So my pan situation is complicated. That's one I haven't answered. And my bathroom products, single-use bathroom plastic products.
I mean, look, we live in a world of plastic. So we cannot feel bad about using some of these objects. Let me just say, since I wrote Dangerous or Safe, and that first edition came out, I think in 2010. So it's been 15 years. I threw away all my Tupperware at that point. I have not, we didn't own a microwave until COVID. And even then I'm very skittish about it. Never put any plastic material in there, partly because it could melt, but mostly because it releases all the plasticizers. I don't keep plastic storage in my house either. And for those of you who do, and I understand the need, please just hand wash it. Don't dishwasher wash it. That is very important. And if it has scrapes on it, that's a time to thank it for its service and throw it away. Because you might think you're saving a buck or two by keeping it around, but the long-term health costs, we don't know. I personally do all the things you do, Vanessa. I go a little bit further because I know the data a little bit more, and I've been doing this for a really long time. People talk about silicone instead of plastic. So like a silicone spatula instead of a plastic spatula and all that. Yes, silicone is better for you, but I'm not convinced personally that it doesn't have any of these other adjuvant,
Right.
these bisphenol, BPA, BPS, BPP, things in there. So honestly, I try to stick with wood, ceramic, cast iron, and steel.
Yeah.
Those are my 4 favorite materials in a kitchen. I'm not going to lie. I cannot tolerate water in a steel bottle. Like when I go to the airport, that flying for me is a real hassle with staying hydrated, because if I bring my own water bottle and fill it up once I go through security, the water at the airport tastes horrible from the water fountains. And they now, in LA at least, they only sell water in steel or like little aluminum containers. And there's some chemical reaction that happens with my teeth where my teeth get super sensitized. And so I actually can't tolerate it. And so water for me when I travel is a little bit of a headache. I mean, I still use toothpaste out of a plastic tube. Like, it's like there are lots of things. But I think overall, if we have a choice between plastic and not, it's gotten easier and easier over time for me to not. That's the exercise I encourage everyone else to do.
Car, can you just answer whether microplastics actually get out of our bodies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is yes. I mean, if we find microplastics in the poop of newborn babies in their meconium, we know microplastics leave, right? There's a lot of data that shows different measurements of bisphenols and PFAS in urine. What does that mean? It means you pee out some of these chemicals. They do stick around for a long time, especially when the physical microplastic is lodged in an organ, but they can come out. And what I really can't wait for is the episode that we get to do about what can you eat or drink to help get these things out of your body. There's a new study that just came out, like literally hot off the presses in the last couple of weeks, looking at a water purifier that's carbon-based that can pull PFAS out of the water supply without having to go to super high temperatures. And I think this is the kind of science that we're going to be able to move sort of down the field enough that we'll be able to figure out if we can do it in a water filter, we can help our kidneys do it, we can help our bodies do it, we can also lower the dose of microplastics going into our body.
So stay tuned for that. We hope we didn't scare the crap out of people too much, but this is really important. And there's some really practical, functional things we can do, some of which actually save us money, right? Like not buying single-use plastic water bottles. Some of us cost us time and money at the outset, but save us health and money in the long term. But again, like you do the best you can in this moment. And send us your ideas. Send us things you've done to change. Help Cara figure out how she can get on a plane with water that doesn't taste gross. Help her, because I have to deal with her on the other end when she's dehydrated and
dehydrated
hungry.
Cara is not fun. Let's just be very clear.
It's almost as bad as hangry Cara. So send us your suggestions, and we will continue to update you on the data and the research. Thanks, Cara.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.